It is Tuesday, November 6th, 2018, Election Day, here in Athens, Georgia. Joining me for another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project is former Congressman Jack Kingston. Mr. Kingston is currently a principal at the storied public policy firm of Squire Patton Boggs in Washington, D.C. A graduate of the University of Georgia, Mr. Kingston was vice president of Palmer & Kay Insurance Services in Savannah. He served in the Georgia House of Representatives from 1985 until 1993 when he was elected to represent Georgia's 1st Congressional District. Re-elected 10 times, Mr. Kingston served in the House of Representatives until January 2015. While in the House, he served on the influential House Appropriations Committee, including chairman of the Subcommittee on Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. He has also served in the House Republican Leadership from 2002 until 2006. Thank you very much, Mr. Kingston, for joining me here today. Do appreciate it.
I'm glad to be here. I'll try to be interesting and intelligent. Two huge challenges.
Hey, you know, we just give it our best try and we go from there. Tell me, if you would, a little bit about your childhood and upbringing. To start us off.
My family moved to Athens in the late 50s, and we lived on Lumpkin Street, and Dad was actually a northerner, and I think the university was trying to import a few.
A diversity hire.
Yeah, he was totally a diversity hire, but he was in the educational psychology department, and my mother was a homemaker, but I'll say this, that before I could say the word League of Women Voters, or the words, I thought it was one word, and I would say, people would say, "Where's your mom?" And I said, "League of Women Voters." And later, I found out that my mother joined the League of Women Voters in the 1960s in Athens because there was no Republican Party.
Interesting.
And so my mother was the political person, and back in those days in Athens, there was Guy Scott and Jack and Jenny Curtis and Betty Bannister and just a handful of people. I mean, here I am. As a kid, I would be the pesky little boy in the living room when they would have their meetings in our house. But that was the Clark County Republican Party, and my mother served as chair. And this was all early 1960s, mid 1960s. It was so bad though that, and I was in a carpool with Lawton Stevens, whose dad was our congressman, and Lawton Stevens, the judge now, was one of my best friends and still is. But Roy Simpkins ran against him, I think in the 1960s, and we had a Roy Simpkins sign in our yard, and that thing would get torn down every single night. And people were just very blatant about it. No, you don't vote Republican here. We're in the South. We don't like Republicans.
Especially not in Bob Stevens' hometown.
And he was a great guy. And my mother was just somebody, who felt like, okay, you need the two-party system, but you need to, we're Republicans. And
So what first attracted you to Republican politics?
Well, I'd say it was my mother's influence, because she did have Republican activism in her blood, and they had lots of the meetings at our house, and then she would drag us to the meetings when she couldn't find a babysitter. And so I think it did get into my hard wiring at an early age. But as a student at the University of Georgia, I studied economics, and it was really macroeconomics that gave me the philosophical underpinning that less government, and that jobs are created best in the private sector, and the fewer laws you have, the more freedom you have. You can have more security, but you give up your freedom for it.
Right.
And so that's when it became a lot more philosophical.
I read where I found an old biographical piece, your background and resume in the Republican Party papers. You were involved in the Republican Party, young Republicans, college Republicans, at a fairly early age.
Yes. Growing up in Athens, I think popularity was always a high value. And I remember my sister said, write down a list of everybody you know. I was a little tiny kid, 10 years old. And like, well, I know you. No, you can't count family. Who do you know? And I just remember this getting in my brain that, okay, the more people you know, the smarter you are, something like that. But I always, and at Clark Junior High School, I was a class officer, and Clark Central High School I was, and then at the University of Georgia, I was the president of the college Republicans, and my wife was president of the Student Senate. And so we actually just kind of, we're always political. And my 21st birthday, I was a delegate to the Clark County Republican Convention, and in 1976, I went to the Kansas City Republican National Committee Convention.
Arena.
Yeah, in Kemper Arena. I was a presidential. We were for Jerry Ford over Ronald Reagan.
Right.
So, but I, enjoyed it from the very start, and believed in it. It wasn't just about a popularity contest or fun. I felt like too much government is running your life and interfering in your life.
So what did you work on any political campaigns other than the Ford campaign in '76?
Not really. My best friend, or one of my best friends, Jonathan Harvey, was my great envy. He went to campaign for this guy that year named Jimmy Carter, and so
I've heard of him.
and he gave me, it was just really interesting listening to Jonathan's stories. And he was another professor's kid, by the way. But I helped a little bit and joined the Chatham County Republican Party when I moved to Savannah, and did the due diligence.
Right.
But it really was in 1984 when a guy named Nelson Sevier ran against an incumbent Democrat named Bobby Phillips in our House seat, and Eric Johnson and I looked at it and said, well, he got 41% of the vote, but out of 12 precincts, he only carried 1. And if we could get just a few other precincts, we could maybe get to 51%. And so Eric and I looked at the numbers, and Eric Johnson back in those days, and he still is, but he's a great numbers cruncher. And so I kind of understood more the people side of the business, and he really understood the mechanics. So he ran the campaign with my wife, and we just put the campaign together. Herb Jones, who was the minority leader at the time, who had run for Congress in 1982 against Lindsey Thomas and got he actually ran against a guy named Jimmy Franklin out of Statesboro, and Herb won the primary, but Lindsey Thomas won the general. But Herb was very helpful to us. Ann Mueller, who was state representative from Chatham County, was then. J.C. Lewis was the Republican mayor of Savannah before I moved there, and John Rosakis beat him. I'm going to guess in 1970-ish, something like that. But J.C. Lewis was still this kind of the godfather of the Republican Party in Chatham County, and a great check writer. And there were just a handful of people you could go to. But I can say this, that we would knock on many doors, and people would look you in the eye and say, I was born a Methodist, I'm going to die a Methodist. I was born a Democrat, I'm going to die a Democrat. And you might be a good guy, but I am not going to vote Republican. That's how hard it was.
Well, 1984, there was this program, Operation Breakthrough, that the Republican Party, John Linder, Nolan Murrah out of Columbus, John Lupton as well, were trying to put together to recruit and finance, such as it was in the early 80s, a couple $1,000s here and there, which was a lot for a Republican legislative candidate. Was that a program that you got looped into as a candidate?
Yes. I can tell you how bad it was, that there were so few Republicans. There were only, when we were running, there was 23 out of 180. There was 23 Republicans, and most of them felt like you didn't have a chance, and they did not want to risk their political goodwill on helping you out a long shot, knowing that it would get them crosswise with Tom Murphy or the House Democrats. So it was very difficult for us to get information on, well, how do you run for office? Because we had never run for office. And so John Linder, John Lupton actually sat down with me in Atlanta and said, this is what you got to do. And they had this Operation Breakthrough, and the idea was to create a better political environment through two competing parties. And since Republican Party, people would tell you back then, said, look, you can run and not change your philosophy, just run as a Democrat. But we wanted to do something different, and back then it was a novelty to be a Republican.
Right. So tell you you actually faced, in that Republican primary, Mike Milford and Nelson Sevier,
Yes.
who had sort of inspired you to run
Yes.
from the previous cycle. What was it like running that campaign? You said you were the I don't want to say glad handing because there's a connotation there, but you were the people person. Eric Johnson's your numbers guy, and your wife's running the campaign. What did running a campaign mean in 1984 for a Savannah, Chatham County Republican?
It really meant going door to door. We could not outraise them, but we could outwork them. And so we came up with this system of going down the street and writing down who lived in which house. And it was you couldn't.
There was no vote builder back then.
Yeah.
So.
There was no digital information,
right.
And so. Lamar Davis, who later became a federal judge appointed by Ronald Reagan, had served in the State House from Savannah, and he was a great mentor to us also. And we would meet with him about every 2 weeks and drive him crazy. But he gave us a lot of advice as well. But it was very hard to raise money, obviously. But we just came up with a sales pitch, which I think I still can remember, but I would say to people, if you give me, I'm Jack Kingston, I'm running for the State House. If you give me 30 seconds, I can give you 3 reasons. And the reasons is I'm a businessman, and people would stop because there, even then, was this impression that it's all lawyers. So, I'm a businessman. Good, because we're tired of lawyers, and you got my vote sometimes.
There you go.
And then I would say I'm the son of an educator. I think we need better schools, and I think we need lower taxes. And I would say that, and then get the heck out of there. And then the closing line, which, I was a commissioned salesman in insurance, and there's this thing called the either or close. And I would say, would you like a yard sign or a bumper sticker?
Either way, you're getting something.
Well, you could. That way, you found out if they really were with you or they just want to get rid of you. And I can tell you, nobody wanted a bumper sticker. No, people hate bumper stickers. So they'd take yard signs, and all of a sudden we started getting great yard sign locations because we had really pushed it. And
interesting. You mentioned that 59% of your your legislative district voted for the Democrat,
yes.
Bobby Phillips.
Yeah.
You turned around in 1984 and won by what was the margin?
We got 58%, but the way we did it really was Ronald Reagan was on the ticket then,
right?
And so we did tie ourselves into Ronald Reagan. We had.
I was going to ask.
Libby and I were as young Republicans when Reagan was running in '80, and Eric was there and a handful of other people. We were asked to work the name tags at a Ronald Reagan event. And of course we said yes. And so Reagan, he goes in the room, he shakes all the hands, and he's running against Jimmy Carter, so it's not a huge crowd. But he got to the end of the line, and they said to the little old punky young Republicans, hey, y'all want to meet the governor, Governor Reagan, go stand at the end of the line. So of course we ran over there, and then it turns out nobody told him where to go next. So he was stuck talking to us, and while that was happening, people were taking pictures. And fortunately, I just read a book about him, so I could carry on a reasonable conversation, and he's a totally personable guy who could have talked to the wall anyhow. But we had this picture of, and we used it, Kingston, Reagan, let's face it, we need conservatives on all levels of government. And our opponent would laugh at us, says, what does Ronald Reagan have to do with the State House in Georgia? But we kept running the ad and in a weekly newspaper, and so it got to be a good.
Which is really, if you think about it, 1984, this nationalizing state legislative districts wasn't really something that was done in Georgia or really elsewhere. So maybe you're a little ahead of your time there. So I don't know who we should give credit to, but
well, I can tell you this though: we had a lot of people like John Carswell, who's my wife's uncle, and a guy named Gene Dawson, Bonnie Gaster, Ray Gaster, J.C. Lewis. A lot of people were there to be very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Wiley Wasden, who was actually one of the first state senators in the Republican Party in Georgia. So
and a former Republican Party chair.
Yes.
With 69 to 71. So you're elected. What's it like for a freshman Republican in the State House in 1985?
It was like being a fire hydrant when a dog approached you. Well, the first time I met...
Go ahead and clarify that for our listeners or viewers.
It was the first time I met Tom Murphy, who was a towering, imposing man. I think he was like 6'4" and very heavy set. I was 29 years old, so, and I had beat this Democrat. And so I mean, he made sure that you weren't really welcomed. Now I'll tell you this, I'm a better politician and a better man having served under Tom Murphy because he made me toughen up, and we actually had a great mutual respect, and he saved me more than once. He was a very partisan guy, but he was a very fair guy.
I see.
And I can't emphasize enough how powerful he was. He was absolutely, in the 1980s, the alpha and the omega of any legislation, plus things that happened outside of the dome. People who were going to be the next state judge or got on the board of transportation and things like that. But we went from 26 to we went from 23 to 26. I was elected with a guy named Dick Ransom out of Augusta and Charles Bannister out of Gwinnett, and so that was our pledge class.
So 26 Republicans. In the 70s and 80s, there's the question of would Republicans be more effective if they had a confrontational strategy or a cooperationist or a cooperational strategy. Which one did you subscribe to?
I tried to split the difference because by being there, I was kind of a threat because I wasn't from, in those days, the Republican Party was Cobb Gwinnett.
Right, the donut.
And we had Ted Waddle from Houston County, and traditionally they always sent a Republican in Houston County, but and then Herb Jones was the one Chatham County that Ann Mueller had taken his slot by then. But John Linder and Dorothy Felton, their view was we got to be more like Newt Gingrich is doing in Washington, D.C. Right. However, coming from Chatham County, where you sort of need things from government, it was a little bit different than being in bedroom Fulton or bedroom Gwinnett County, where you can just raise cane because none of your constituents want anything. But if you live in an area where you got a beach that needs renourishing or shrimp boats that have some issues with
the ports.
Yeah, you had to be a little more conciliatory. And I can say this, I feel like to this day, it's still important to get along with the other party. Don't run from your jersey color, but realize that the person in the opposite party is there because their constituents feel that their vision of Georgia or America is the right one. So you have to work with everybody.
What sort of policy were you and not just a freshman, but in your time in the state legislature, you were always in the minority. How were you able to, like you said, affect change that would help your constituents or get those services or get that funding for services that your constituents wanted and needed? How were you able to do that?
Johnny Isaacson was our minority leader, Republican leader, and a guy named Luther Colbert was our whip. And then in the Senate, Paul Coverdale was 9 senators, I think it was 9. He was the Senate Republican leader. But Coverdale and Isaacson both really taught us to read the legislation. And you're forgiven for being a Democrat or Republican, but you're not forgiven for not knowing what you're voting on. And so back in that day, they drilled it into you that you really needed to. You could ask anything you wanted, but don't ask the stupid questions. So the way we survived is you read the legislation, you asked thoughtful questions, you made thoughtful contributions, and then you just weren't a jerk about things.
Right.
Because sometimes you could be a jerk and people get pretty tired of you quick because Tom Murphy sort of let people know that when somebody's asking an antagonistic question, they're insulting me and they're insulting you, and we're not going to put up with it. But it was always a balance because the folks back home, their constituents are funny. They want you to raise hell, then on the other side they want you to get the port dredged, and sometimes you can't do both.
Right.
Doesn't mean you go along to get along, but you just can't be that, desk-pounding dissenter on every vote.
Were there any desk pounding dissenters in the legislature when you were there?
Yeah, there were some Gwinnett County guys who could do that, and interestingly, the year I got elected, Dick Lane from Fulton County had switched parties, and
Down in East Point, I think?
yes,
Yeah.
and he had one reason why he did it. Everybody told me is because he had made such a fuss as a Republican that the only way he'd have any credibility was to switch parties, and so then he started getting along. But Ann Mueller could get under the Speaker's skin, but he still liked her. But there was just certain people with a safer district who could get out there. There was this wonderful man named Paul Hurd who,
Coweta County.
yeah,
I believe.
and he kind of taught me, you know what, it's okay to become friends with some Democrats. And there was a guy named Charlie Watts and Wayne Gardner who were just totally nice to me. Most members were not nice to you at all if you were a Republican.
Really?
Yeah, particularly a young Republican. The older ones were a little bit, but the young ones, oh God, very, very tough on me.
Interesting. I guess the perception's always, this is a clubby, collegial kind of.
Not in those days. If you were a Republican, I can tell you there was some.
Well, speaking of a Republican, as a legislator, it's a part-time job. But if you were involved in building the party, what was your interaction with the state Republican Party at that time?
When I ran in 1984, there was very, very little instruction from the party, and there was there was no monetary help whatsoever. Right. But the party did grow and get stronger and more viable as time went on. And elected officials always kind of look at the party as, hey, you want the party to be strong, but you have a broader constituency.
Right.
So the party did grow, and parties fluctuate depending on who's in office and
Sure.
what the issues are and so forth. But I was always one who would go to the Republican club meetings and the precinct meetings because that's the way I grew up. I was right after college. I was a delegate for my precinct and our commission district and to state and county conventions. And
what was your proudest accomplishment of your time before we move on? Talk about your congressional career. What were you proudest about? Coming out of producing in the legislature during your years.
Well,
there?
the big issue that really helped me get elected was Wilmington Island, which is a large residential island in Chatham County, wanted to incorporate. Back in those days,
incorporation was a
yes. Dorothy Felton was the one who really pushing Sandy Springs.
Right.
And this was pre-Milton and pre-Johns Creek, and but Wilmington Island wanted to do it, and Dorothy Felton and Johnny Isaacson got me on the State Planning and Community Affairs Committee, which was chaired by a guy named G.D. Adams, whose daughter, Gracie Phillips, was politically active as well. But I learned a lot about city governments then because of that experience. And we settled the issue. They got their referendum and voted it down, but just getting that thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at Sandy Springs'
I
experience.
mean, so I'd say that may have been the high water mark of my career.
Well, you decide to run for, after Senator Mac Mattingly says he's not going to run for the 1st Congressional District seat in '92. What made you realize that this was your time to sort of move up?
Remember, Mattingly had been beat by White Fowler.
Right.
So the seat was held by Lindsey Thomas.
Right.
And Lindsey announced his
retirement. That's right. I'm jumping ahead to when there was speculation that Mac Mattingly was going to run for that seat from down in St. Simons. So you're right. Lindsey Thomas is the incumbent Democrat.
Yes, and so what had happened is when you serve in the state legislature in Georgia, it was true then, it's even more true now, it's a very difficult job. It's a part-time job. It's almost a full-time job that gives you part-time pay. It's very difficult for somebody outside of the Atlanta area to serve in the legislature and have a family and have a job.
Right.
So after 8 years, I had realized that I have got to go full-time politics or get out of it. And so it actually was a relatively easy decision, and it was based on personal reasons, but politically, the big thing that happened was reapportionment.
Right.
Because the Voting Rights Act had really kicked into high gear, and the Voting Rights Act started out saying you can't discriminate. And then 10 years down the road, it was you have to maximize minority voting strength. And you can't stack or crack the minority populations. And so Cynthia McKinney, who actually sat next to me on reapportionment, had hooked up with the Bush administration and the Republican Department of Justice. And it was really the strange bedfellows of politics that, okay, if we create a number of African American districts, then the byproduct will be more Republican districts. But even then, the view of the legislature was, well, you can say all you want, but the only people who are going to vote for you are from Savannah, because people from Waycross and Alman and Baxley and Patterson, Georgia, they're not going to vote Republican. Well, that turned out not to be the case. We have a guy named Brent Gaston and William Clark who were very involved in our campaign, and they put us to work. Another guy named Jimmy Stewart, a good UGA grad. In fact, all these guys were, I think. So, but we found out that the rural people, that the Democrat Party had made a fatal assumption. And that fatal assumption was that the people who've been voting Democrat for 100 years were going to continue to vote Democrat. And what had happened is the people in these rural counties started looking at the National Democrat Party, saying, well, I'm not with Bill Clinton, and I'm not with Michael Dukakis. And so, you know, the guy named Kingston comes to my neighborhood, I'm going to listen to him. And that's what happened.
So you had some token primary opposition, but the race was really going to be it was Barbara Christmas versus Buddy DeLoach on the. Did you have a preference for who was going to come out of that race that you would have preferred to run against as a Republican in 92?
I actually did. I felt like Buddy would be a better opponent because Barbara Christmas, and what had happened, there were two Republicans in the race and 9 Democrats, and because the assumption was, well, whoever wins the Democrat primary will win. And so I felt like Buddy DeLoach would be the better one because Barbara Christmas had been getting all this national press. And what had happened, it was the Year of the Woman, 1992. We think there's a Year of the Woman every 5 years or something.
Every generation.
Yes. So unfortunately for her, the New York Times came down and wrote a story, great story about her, but it was a puff piece. How this woman was taking on the good old boys and basically the Georgia Crackers, and Barbara Christmas is a good woman, good candidate, but it was an insult the way the article wrote. I see. And so she kind of got painted as being liberal and not one of us, so to speak. And remember 1992, people were a lot more inclined to say, I don't want somebody the New York Times likes. Right.
So what were the issues that you ran? Eric told me that the campaign slogan that was we don't need Christmas in November.
Yes,
which is fantastic and in the pantheon of great campaign slogans in Georgia history. But what were the issues that you took to those voters who you say that sort of press alienated them? What was it that you were offering as an alternative as a Republican?
We tried to build a coalition on agribusiness because I had been in the insurance business and I had sold insurance to farmers and food processors and so forth, so I could minimize my city of Savannah problem. Another misconception was that Savannah would never have the congressman because the rural areas would always vote against Savannah. So, but fortunately, I had sold agribusiness, and so we built that up, and then small businesses, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, for example, we said, I'm the business candidate. Pro-life was, abortion's almost a bigger issue now than it was then.
Right.
But there was a group of pro-lifers, and so we had, and kind of back up on abortion a minute. When I was in the state legislature, it was considered a federal decision. You could say if you were pro-life, pro-choice, it didn't matter. There was never going to be an abortion vote. But and Roe v. Wade that set that up was 1973. But in 1989, while I was still in the legislature, there was a Webster versus Missouri Health Services that said, the federal government said, you know what, the state of Missouri could actually oversee an abortion clinic. And then in 91, there was a Casey versus Pennsylvania decision that even further strengthened the state's right to get involved in abortion. So what had happened is this issue that people felt was locked away sort of became to, hey, wait a minute, states actually do have some influence on it. Then more importantly, technology had changed in that suddenly women were having sonograms that found there was a heart, and then ultrasounds that showed an image. So technology and the Supreme Court started changing the abortion thing, but we were pro-life, and on abortion you really have two choices. You're pro-life or pro-choice. It's not there's no degrees of it almost. And so that was another one of our coalitions. And then we had the Republicans, and the Republicans were just, out there, but we united them because a lot of people felt like it would be nice to have a Republican. We haven't really had a Republican. And in those days, the only Republican from Georgia was Newt Gingrich.
Right.
So there, my freshman class we had John Linder, who had run previously but not won. He was elected, and then Matt Collins.
Right.
And then there was this Democrat named Nathan Deal, who about 6 months later, maybe less than that, came
April,
over.
I think.
Yeah.
April '95. Yeah. Or no. It was
93.
Right.
So, yeah.
So how much coordination did you have with the Coverdell campaign, who was running for Senate at the time, or the Bush campaign operation in '92?
We did not have that much. We had a lot more with Newt Gingrich.
Interesting.
And Newt had his own campaign operation, and he had a guy named Joe Gaylor who had written a book called Flying Upside Down, and that was our Bible. And Flying Upside Down was, how to get elected when you have no money, and just shoestring campaigns. And so Newt had organized a political action committee that wasn't a big money thing, but an educational committee.
GoPac.
Called GoPac, yes. And every Thursday night there were GoPac calls. And remember, this is pre-computers, pre-web pages and links and everything else. So you dial into a toll-free number at, I think it was like, 10 o'clock on Thursday nights, and they'd give you here's what you need to do to go door to door, and here's how you should raise money, and here's how you should have a good event, and here's how to prepare for a debate prep. And so Newt Gingrich and Joe Gaylor, in my situation, and I think many, many others, they were a huge factor, a lot bigger than the state party or the.
Interesting.
But now in Coverdell, though, we had a healthy relationship with his campaign, but we did not coordinate with his campaign.
So you get up to Congress. You left the Georgia legislature in the minority. You get to Congress in the minority. What was it like? Again, you're a freshman Republican in the legislature, minority party. What were similarities and the differences?
It's a huge step because you think you have a grip on the state government, which you really don't, but you think you do. And then you go to Congress, and then you realize how big the country is, and now we're a lot more, but I think then probably 290 million people or something like that, and you realize how big the world is. And there are a lot of impressive people there, and people you've heard of in some cases, household type names. So there's a little bit of intimidation. But what really surprised me is that in the legislature, there was kind of a third on the left and a third on the right who probably had a good function of raising Cain, but it was really the third in the middle that ran the show. In Washington, you play to the hard left or the hard right, and then the negotiations come in the middle at the end, but that's what surprised me. And when you think about 435 members, everybody's in a hurry. You're not sitting in the chamber. You don't get to know each other the way you did in the state legislature. And so it's a different atmosphere, but I would say most people are pretty professional to the degree that no one got there by accident. Everybody had very tough campaigns, and they had to do some things right to beat the other person. And so you could kind of get in the legislature by fluke. in Congress, you can't get there by fluke. It has to be a very deliberate, very strong campaign to become a member.
So in '92, Bob Michael would have been the Republican minority leader in the House. Tell me about Bob Michael, because you had been close with Newt Gingrich, and we'll get to him. But what was the Republican leadership like, and how was your interaction as a freshman with leadership?
It's interesting you should ask, because previously you had touched on, are you confrontational or do you get along?
Yeah.
Bob Michael landed at Normandy Beach. He was a war hero. He was a gentleman. He had this beautiful voice. He would frequently be asked to sing at dinners and so forth. Everybody loved Bob Michael, but Bob Michael was not a charging
Midwest nice.
he was not a Newt Gingrich. And Bob Michael actually even said about my freshman class, I think there were 43 of us or something, and he said, we got a lot of hardtails and there are only 7 thoughtful ones among the whole crew. He said that publicly. And this is this wonderful man, but I don't think he ever knew my name. I mean, he just was. It just wasn't on his. It was the tail end of a chapter that was coming to a close.
Right.
And Newt Gingrich had, Bob Michael and Jack Kemp and Trent Lott, a number of others had come up with, let's use the C-SPAN after hours cameras and start driving
Vin Weber
the message.
From Minnesota.
Yeah, and Vin Weber. And remember, there was no cable news back then.
Right.
So CNN or C-SPAN was the sort of the political game in town, and so Newt really pushed, do the special orders when Congress closes, go out there and start talking about taxes and the deficit and welfare reform. But Newt was just totally different brand of leadership.
Right.
And but I remember one time we had teamed up in a rare case with the freshman Democrats to dismantle 3 standing committees. They were select committees that were no longer needed, but they had become standing committees, even though they were select committees. I mean, that's inside baseball, but the point was the committees were no longer needed.
Right.
We got together with the Democrats, and we could save a few $1 million by eliminating these committees, and so we won this amendment on the floor. Bob Michael stood up and said to the Democrat speaker, well, Mr. Speaker, there's a compromise on the floor. There's a compromise out there that could get us out of this situation. And we, as the freshman Republicans, said, what are you talking about? We just won. This thing is over with. We just won. You don't have to compromise. But that's how the vision kind of was.
I guess the thesis, maybe John Linder said this before when I was interviewing him, is that you had to have the conflict to create a distinction. Yes. Between Tom Foley-led Democratic Party and a Bob Michael-led Republican Party. So '94 rolls around, the contract with America. Was that only open to freshmen, or is that something that you would have run on as a Republican running for re-election in '94?
No, I would have run on it.
Okay.
I was in support of it. We all signed the contract on the House steps, and the difference with the contract was it was a very clear vision that here's 10 things that politicians have been talking about forever. If you get us in the majority, we will do these things. And that was a huge distinction. And I think also the Democrats had been in power for 40 plus years, and they'd gotten a little sloppy. Sure. A lot of their committee chairmen had been there forever. They had built up their own fiefdoms, and so they were the old bulls. And now, the longer I stayed, the more I appreciated them, frankly. But they were their own power centers. But we had the assault weapon ban, which really people were outraged about, and the Clinton tax increase, and there were some things that Clinton was doing that were easy to criticize.
A lot of controversial policies in that first 2 years, I guess.
Yeah.
So now tell me the difference. This is the first time you've ever served in the majority. What was the practical difference for you as the congressman from the 1st Congressional District of Georgia in '95?
And as a freshman, and I'm still friends with him, Bob Carr from Detroit was a Democrat who was chairman of the Appropriations Committee that funded the bridge, and part of my job was to try to get money for the Sidney Lanier Bridge expansion. in Brunswick. And so I had to go kind of hat in hand with this guy I didn't know in the Democrat Party. Now, got it done, but as a Republican, in contrast, you could just call up Frank Wolf, who took Bob Carr's place, and say, hey, Frank, I need more money for the bridge. And if you're in the majority, you could get that done really easy. It's a much easier lift.
Was that a good feeling after never being?
It was a very, I mean, for me, that 10 years in politics, and then finally I'm in the majority. I did not know what to do with myself. But what was interesting, people were coming to see us, and that's one of the problems with being the majority. I think people who've never been the minority think, well, this is the way it's run, and it's not run that way. It's just the majority has the spoils.
Well, as first congressional district, and you mentioned how important reapportionment was to getting elected. Next round of reapportionment rolls along. Democrats back at home, Governor Barnes, Bobby Kahn, start tinkering with the maps.
Yes.
Tell me about that experience being redistricted basically together with your colleague, Saxby Chambliss, who was in the 8th.
Yes.
And then redistricted into basically put both your homes in the same
Saxby
district.
and I went to dinner one night. I think it was Bull Feathers, and we just sat down and said, Saxby, we came here as friends. We're going to leave here as friends. We're not going to run against each other, but one of us has got to run and one of us got to stay at home. I've got 4 kids, small children. I don't know how I can do it. And Saxby was, he's a little older, and he just said, no, I think I'll take this race on. And I said, well, I'll be with you 100% of the way. And so we just really sat down and over a meal worked it out.
I read somewhere that either it was press speculation or some pressure from groups or individuals for you to jump into the governor's race against Roy Barnes and for Saxby to take on Max Cleland. Was that ever something that you entertained running for governor in 2002?
I flirted with it, and people flirted with me a number of times to run. Having 4 small children at home and being geographically on the wrong part of the state would have made it run very difficult. When I did run statewide, I bought a condominium in Atlanta, and my kids were out of the house.
Right.
So that was the first chance I got, but politically that timing wasn't as good as it would have been in previous races.
I see. So this comes around, 2002. Did you expect those Republican victories, Saxby Chambliss's win against Max Cleland, Sonny Perdue's win against Roy Barnes? It's a question I always ask, and I'm always interested to hear the reaction.
Saxby's did not surprise me because I had been in that from the very beginning, and I just felt like he had a really good shot at it. Now, Roy's was, Sonny's over Roy's was a lot more of a surprise because Roy Barnes had $10 million, and I think Sonny had like $3 million, and we had, as Republicans, never had gotten there with a Republican governor before. So it was very, it went up logarithmically,
Well, what do you think, because the Republicans in the 1990s, and you had been there and you had seen it, had flirted with victory statewide. Guy Milner came excruciatingly close in 1994. Competitive in 96 and 98, and Republican Party continues to grow at the congressional level, but there was no breakthrough. What do you think it was about 2002, the factors that drove those victories for Saxby and Sonny Perdue?
I think a lot of it was that Bush was very well organized. Bush was very popular in 2002, and they helped Saxby a lot. And so, Karl Rove was very involved in it, and he had Tom Perdue, no relation to Sonny, who was, quite a political mastermind, calling a lot of the good shots. And Saxby was a great campaigner. I think with Roy Barnes, Roy had overplayed his hands. Roy's a very smart guy, but I think part of the, challenge of politics is you better respect the people and be very careful. And he had tried to change the flag, and there was a couple of things that he did, which is people got ticked off about, and it was in many cases the way he did it.
Right. So 2002, you've got basic way of saying it, what did that mean for the Republican Party in Georgia? You're up in Washington, but what does it mean now? There's a senator back in Washington. There's a governor in the mansion.
Well, suddenly, we're the majority party after, this long trek of being in the minority and being scorned and laughed at, humiliated, and so forth. And then all the business community totally realigned, and many of the large corporations in Georgia had been favoring the status quo, favoring the Democrat leadership, playing it safe as much as anything else. But now suddenly they were all coming up front saying, yeah, we're glad, and we actually want things. And I think that the great legacy of all that is just last week, Georgia was 6 years in a row rated the best state in the union to do business in, and I don't think that happened overnight or by accident. Now, I can tell you selfishly, for members of Congress, you didn't have to worry about, your district seats being chopped. And I survived 5 reapportionments, and it's a very stressful process because you're at the whim of the state legislature.
Right, because in 2011 another round came. Your district wasn't altered all that much in 2011, or what? Or was it?
Well, we're a growth area, and there's always you lose things around the edges, but we were okay with it.
So you jumped into you mentioned running for U.S. Senate. You jumped into the race May 2013, so relatively early for when Saxby announced that he was retiring. What drove that decision? You basically, it seems like you could have stayed in Georgia's first congressional district. We mentioned Carl Vinson earlier off camera. Maybe you could have given Carl Vinson a run for his money in breaking that record. What made you want to take a stab at statewide office, higher office?
Well, one thing that's important is that the Senate is a much better bully pulpit. That if you're a U.S. Senator and you want to talk about welfare reform or the military or taxes, you're going to have more people listening to you. And even if they sometimes accomplish a lot less than the House, it's still a better bully pulpit. And that was one thing that attracted to me. Senators have appointment approval over the president, and he has to seek their advice and consent on. And because of that, the White House drools all over senators because anybody could be a potential vote, yay or nay, on a Supreme Court justice or an undersecretary of transportation. So they get a lot better service out of the executive branch. And then I just think that in my case, I had passed up statewide opportunities a number of times.
Right.
And I was in a good spot. My kids were out of the house and had an opportunity to do it.
So tell me, what's the difference between running for Congress in coastal Georgia versus running a statewide election in the largest state east of the Mississippi?
Well, I think in Congress it's a lot more retail. You go to a lot more barbecues and traditional debates and handshaking opportunities.
Meet and greet kind of thing.
But in the Senate, I mean, you almost don't need to in a state of 10 million people like Georgia. If you had to do it over again, money was no problem. You'd do enough of those things to get the photo op, but then you would just have good ads and run your campaign from a media center.
So from the outset, when you were planning this campaign, you sort of have to assess your strengths and weaknesses as a candidate. What were those strengths and weaknesses that you self-reflectively understood going into the race?
Well, having served in the legislature and learned a lot about municipal governments because of that experience, I had a good grip on city and state government, and then having been in Congress for 22 years, I knew the federal governments and the big issues in terms of trade and taxes and military use of force and so forth, and agriculture, because I chaired the Agriculture Appropriations Committee, and I had a lot of knowledge that would have been a great asset in the Senate, and it still is a good asset, but not utilized as much on the private sector.
Right. Well, what about your weaknesses that you had to assess?
Well, politics, love it when people say, "Oh, timing is everything in politics." Well, that's not a profound statement because you can't control time. And
There you go.
so I ran at a time when David Perdue was able to make the argument that, well, Kingston's an incumbent. Look what's not getting done. We need an outsider. And it's a pretty good argument. So, in maybe 10 years earlier, people said, look at all the experience Kingston has. He knows a lot of stuff, and he knows where all the counties are, and he's been here. But this time it was, we want an outsider because we are fed up with you people in Washington.
You sort of maybe mentioned it or hinted at it earlier. Do you think that geographically you were not helped as much by being a coastal Georgian? You're from Athens, but you hadn't been back in a while.
Well, if you look at when Nathan Deal ran,
Right.
he had a really good base from
Sure.
a congressional district that was growing, because congressional districts are created equally, but they don't stay equal. So what happens if you have 700,000 people in a congressional district on reapportionment day? 3 years down the road, one might be up to 730,000, one could be down to 680,000.
Right.
And coastal Georgia was not keeping up with North Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember exactly, but something like 60% of the votes are in the Atlanta donut area,
Yeah.
and most of the votes are above I-20. So for us in Savannah to get anywhere, you have to drive and drive and drive, and that does hurt you.
And you just don't start off with the sort of banked votes that somebody like a Nathan Deal did in 2010.
He had a tremendous base, and so and then David Perdue had name ID because Sonny, and he was a self-funder, and we would have to do all these little $10, $15, $20. We raised money, but we did a fundraiser after fundraiser, and David had an advantage of not having to do as many as we did.
A bit more time and energy intensive. The fundraisers and the dinners. Looking back, do you think you would have fared better in the primary or the runoff, the runoff especially, had it been a Karen Handel or a Paul Brown or a Phil Gingrey or something like that?
Well, I think we could say yes, because I lost. But David and I turned out to we've been allies, and I told him that I would endorse him, which I did the night of the election, and so. The one thing about politics is you cannot afford to have a long memory. You should have a long memory when it comes to remembering your friends, but you need to have a short memory and realize that when people are attacking you, they're doing what they're doing and you're doing what you're doing, and you can't take it personally. Thick skin is very important.
Right. So looking back on your time in Congress, you had time to be in the Republican leadership, you chaired committees. What were you, similar question to the earlier one, what were you most proud of in producing in those years?
We were very involved in military. We got a lot of good construction projects in Fort Stewart, Moody Air Force Base. I did a lot with the port dredging, and getting the port dredge is a huge economic boom.
Still in the news.
Yes. So we were very involved in that. One of the things, kind of a smaller thing, but it was very important at the time, we developed a pond building program so that South Georgia farmers could get a pond built. And it wasn't so much to get the economic assistance as it was getting the permitting. And so some farmers even call them the Kingston ponds. And I was very proud of that, because I just think, the more water you have, you want to capture the surface water. And
right.
It's something that's needed to be done. We worked real hard on beach renourishment, and did a lot of various funding issues for miscellaneous concerns around the state.
Is there anything you wish you had accomplished that just didn't happen for one reason or another? Timing, the votes weren't there?
Well, I'll tell you, people don't understand how the world looks up to the United States. And on congressional trips, when you go to a foreign country, particularly a smaller country or developing country, it is a big deal for them. And I had some really good trips, and went to South Sudan, went to Rwanda, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. But I wish I had adopted 2 or 3 countries from the very beginning and became the expert in that one area of the world, because you have that ability as a member of Congress to walk into a country, speak to the heads of state, try to figure out what we can do for them, and you can have some real international impact.
Now, you've remained active politically, even though you've left Congress. What have you, other than your work at Patton Boggs, what is it that how have you stayed active?
Well, John Padgett asked me if I would run the fundraising foundation for the Republican Party, and I did that for 2 years and enjoyed doing that. But then I got involved with the Ted Cruz campaign, and then when he lost, went to the Trump campaign as a surrogate. And as you know, many times the president would say things that people disagreed with, and so they needed a whole bunch of worker bees to do CNN and MSNBC particularly, but in radio shows and everything else. But I would always kind of laugh. Newt Gingrich and Giuliani would go on Fox, and Sean Hannity would say, "Hey, don't you think Hillary's bad?" And Newt would say, "Yes." And Rudy, what do you think? "Oh, yeah, it's very bad." And then I'd be on another show, MSNBC, and they'd say, "Well, it says here when Trump was in the 8th grade, he threw a rock and hit a cat in the head. What do you have to say with that? Does he hate all the animals?" Or those. I was in the
different dynamic.
Yeah, I can tell you that we had some really tough shows that we had to do, and the Donald would lean into it, you might say, but he was he is an interesting and exciting character. And the thing that I do like about Trump, and one of the things that attracted me to the campaign, was that I think after 22 years that you do need to have that town shook up. And it gets back to one of your opening questions about, are you confrontational or do you get along? And I think that if you look at, there are a lot of people who go to Washington as great gentlemen, but nothing gets accomplished. Trump has accomplished a lot. Just one thing, moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, every member of Congress, from Chuck Schumer to Bob Dole to Mitch McConnell and everybody, going back for 20 years, has said, let's move that embassy, and even signed a pledge. But it took Donald Trump to actually do it. And that's just a small example.
I guess I'd take a step back a second. That was a field of 19 I think it was 19 Republicans ran for president in 2015, 2016. Why did you initially settle on Ted Cruz as sort of your candidate that you wanted to back?
Well, his campaign manager, Jeff Rowe, is a friend of mine, and he ran my campaign. And when everybody was in this race, really, particularly in Georgia, all the smart money went to Jeb Bush. And Jeff called me and said, "We really need somebody, and you haven't declared." Like Eric Johnson was with Governor Walker with Wisconsin, and a lot of people, Jason Avenatti was with Rubio, and you had a lot of respectable people just sort of dividing up here, there, and everywhere. But so Jeff asked me to help out with Cruz, and the more I got to know Cruz, the more I liked him. He's an enormously intelligent man, and he's somebody who shook up the system too. So I felt like, we do need to have this town shook up.
Is Senator Cruz going to win tonight?
He is. There was on a call with him week before last, and it's looking good.
Okay. If we can just zoom out a little bit, maybe we touched on this earlier, but why were the Georgia Democrats able to hold power in this state for so long? 1868 to 2003.
Well, I would say wisdom, justice, and moderation. They were moderate, and a guy like Tom Murphy could hold the coalitions of the Atlanta people and the rural people together. But then as the state changed and you had the rise of African American centric politics, or the women's caucus centric type politics, and a little more distinction between rural and urban, it came harder and harder to hold the coalition together. But I'd say if you look at the governors, George Busby and Joe Frank Harris,
Right.
Zell Miller, they were always probably more moderate leaning to the right than anything else. So, for many of the Democrats who, after Sonny Perdue was elected and prior to then, who switched parties, it wasn't that hard for them because they were generally conservative anyhow.
Well, that's a good segue. Some Democrats, and you've mentioned them, George Busby, Joe Frank Harris, Sam Nunn, even, always campaigned and ran and even governed as Georgia Democrats. They made
Yes.
that distinction from a national Democrat or Dukakis Democrat. Do those distinctions have any meaning today, a Georgia Democrat versus a national Democrat?
Not in this election cycle. I think it will come back to it, but I do think more the Democrat Party as the Ocasio-Cortezes and the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth
It's sort
Warrens.
of the left wing of the Democratic Party.
Yes, and the Stacey Abrams. I mean, it's a pretty hard left approach to government.
What about the Republican Party? Is there a distinction between the sort of Republicans who govern under the dome versus Republicans who go to Congress or run statewide in Georgia?
I think the ones under the dome tend to be a little more evangelical Republicans than the ones in Washington. And Washington's a little more military hawks and economic conservatives. And a lot of Republicans have been worried about Donald Trump. I mean, he lurches the philosophical vehicle around with them on it, and they don't know what to do with him, and they have been very critical of him. I think most of them have kind of come on board and calmed down because they see his policies and the unemployment and the peace through strength and stuff like that. But I think one of the things that Bob Hanna, who was a Democrat chairman of reapportionment, told me, he says, you guys are going to get to the point that we were. When we were in the ruling, we got too used to it, and we got too liberal, and we started listening to our fringe too much. And if that happens, then you're out of it. And I think the Republican Party has to be very careful. Most Americans are, in the middle. That they might be left of center or right of center, but they're not hard right and they're not hard left.
Is that what you think? Speaking about here in Georgia, and maybe it's the same answer for Washington as well. What is the greatest danger that faces a Republican majority?
Well, Donald Trump has just pulled out all these intense emotions from people who dislike him. They dislike him more than necessary. And I think that the media has shared some of the blame in that the media is, kind of allows Antifa and the resistance and some of the mobs to misbehave without much scrutiny. And I think we should really demand better behavior. But one reason why this election, I think, is so emotional is because the left hasn't accepted the results of the 2016 election.
Critics on the left, as you say, would point to this guy who sends pipe bombs out to people. So what do you make of this sort of? It seems like a very heightened, tense time politically. You've been there since 1984 in politics, 1992 national politics. Is that just a sense, or is that real, that there's tension out there that's something new?
I think it is real, and I think that it's not new as much as it's a little just more in front of us, out of the closet, if you will. And I think that the stakes are so high when it comes to people's personal freedom and constitutional rights that we don't know how to agree or disagree in an honorable fashion.
Right.
One thing, though, having grown up politically under the shadow of World War II leadership, my dad and everybody in the 1960s or 70s played a role in World War II, some level or the other. And so when I was in the state legislature in the early 80s, or in the mid-'80s, most of the men there had been in World War II or wore a uniform. They shared that common experience in doing something greater than themselves. And so they realized, hey, the war effort is more important than me. America's more important than me. And then when they, the next decades of their life, they realized that, hey, America, country comes first, and then public service is to support that effort. And I think one of the big differences in today's leader is they haven't had that worldwide experience. I mean, we saw it for a short time in America after 9/11, but we quickly lost it.
Right. Even in this sort of tense period that we're talking about, hyper-partisanship, are there issues either here in Georgia or in Washington that Democrats and Republicans can realistically work together on?
I think they can. One of the problems is sometimes parties want the issue more than they want the solution. But I do think when it comes to the big issues of the day, you got to work together, whether it's healthcare or immigration or solving the debt. One thing that both parties seem to be united in is ignoring the deficit right now, and the chickens are going to come home to roost at some point.
Why do you think that is? You were in Congress for several years, and you know what it's like to pass a budget and raise debt ceilings and things like that. For the longest time, when Barack Obama was in office, there was a lot of discussion about the deficit and the national debt, and Donald Trump's now in the White House, and as you said, the problem seems to have continued. Why is that?
I think that the Republican Party misses the fact that when we want to increase military spending, the Democrats are going to want to increase social spending. And I can promise you most Republicans don't realize that, but as somebody who sat on the Appropriations Committee for 20 years, every time you put $1 in a new tank, you're going to put in 85 cents to a social program, or you can't get the votes to pass the bill. And it's so hard to get Americans through their representatives to do something proactively. And most people are, enjoying the fruits of entitlement programs, and they don't want to hear about it costing too much money.
Do you think this really touches on it? Do you think in Washington, at least, we'll separate Georgia from this, but the government has become, governing by crisis? Is that the only way things get done in Washington?
I think it's one of the greatest ways, because if you sit down and say, listen, let's have a thoughtful discussion, a bipartisan discussion on reducing the debt, people back home can say, yeah, that makes sense to me. That's not the way politics works. And a lot of times I've heard business people say, why can't Congress be run like a business? Because it's not. It's not set up to run like a business, so you can just forget that. And it's not really set up for thoughtful bipartisan cooperation. As much as you might pine for it, as much as you might have the moral high ground that it's the right thing to do, try running for office and try getting that accomplished in the U.S. Congress. It's very difficult. There's too much money in politics trying to bring people into their own camps. And Democrats or Republicans who stray too far off their own party message, they're going to get punished. They're going to lose in a primary.
Is there a solution to that? One of the ideas that has always been pitched is politically nonpartisan redistricting. Obviously, that doesn't touch governor's mansions or the Senate, but is that something that would, you think, possibly reduce that sort of run to the fringe?
I would kind of like to see it only for a limited period of time. I don't want to lose that right constitutionally, take it out of the legislative branch. But I can say this. If you come from what's called an R20 district, meaning a Republican district, if the Democrat and Republican are equal, the Republican has 20% advantage. D20 would be the same thing. And if you look at the members who come from D20, D5s, or well, not D5, but a D10, the D30 in some cases, John Lewis being an example.
Or Doug Collins on the Republican side.
I mean, they're the only way they're going to get beat is from the primary. And so, you might have a better mix if you make the districts a little more competitive, and then people would have to listen to all sides.
We talked about Donald Trump's election, and on election night here in Georgia, if you saw, as a Democrat watching it, and you see the polls, the returns are coming in, Hillary Clinton's carrying Cobb County, Hillary Clinton carries Henry, Gwinnett. You would think, just looking at the metro, that was, she was going to carry the state. Obviously, that didn't happen. But we talked about earlier how, the metro donut was really the heartland for Georgia Republicans. And now it seems that that's possibly trending the other way, and we'll know a whole lot more after tonight. What do you make of that sort of demographic evolution and what that means for the two-party system?
It's going to be interesting because where Republicans are hurting right now are women, college grads, and seniors. And some of these college grads are going to grow up and have families of their own and probably reevaluate who they're voting for or why. Mm-hmm. So they'll come home. I think to the degree that the national politics on women and seniors are up for grab, I'm more interested in, well, what about Hispanic voters? Can we get them? And in places like Texas or California, where Republicans have heavily Hispanic districts, they do okay with them, but they've got to know that constituency better. And I think things do shift around politically as people reevaluate. Catholics, for example, particularly in Savannah, used to be huge Democrats, and now because of abortion, they're all Republicans. So these things do change, but they follow an issue and a time period.
What do you think do you think Donald Trump's presidency, his election, is going to have a long-term effect on Republican partisanship or the Republican Party's ideology or outlook?
Well, here's where I think I would love his legacy to be, is where you can just actually disagree, maybe not the way he disagrees, but just I think he has taken on the institutions, whether it was the press, whether it was the Republican Party, the establishment in Washington, D.C. I like the fact that he took those things on, and I would love to see politicians be a little more free to speak out. And, maybe you can't do it if you don't have the money that he has. But to me, I think it's been refreshing, not always pleasant, but refreshing to hear somebody who's not afraid to say things. I think in terms of what he's done with the economy, the lesson to us is clear. Less regulation, pro-business creates jobs, and we should all be happy about that. I do think he is not using the bully pulpit effectively when it comes to sitting down and doing the warm and fuzzy stuff that you need to do.
There's always been the discussion in the talking heads and pundits and the media. Is there going to be a pivot where we're going to see a President Trump be able to sit down at those conference tables or go play that role of consoler in chief that Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were so capable of doing that we just haven't seen yet? Do you think that's something you grow into, or is this
I think it's a little bit of both, but I can say this. Here's the guy who shoots 11 people tragically in a synagogue, and he's an anti-Trumper. But you have to dig to find that in the press. The guy hated Donald Trump. And so I think part of it is the press that just says, look, we're not going to let this guy reconcile when he should. And then other times when he doesn't show the sensitivity like in Charlottesville that he should have. And so I think that if he did, it would be hugely important for him politically. I think if the Democrats take the House, the system won't let him get along, because I think their base is going to want him impeached. And so he's going to use the Democrats to get reelected the way Bill Clinton did.
We are, this is election day. And if you mentioned the Democrats taking the House, say that, the scenario that you just pointed out doesn't happen. What could a Democratic House, a Republican Senate, and a Republican Donald Trump presidency. What could be accomplished there, do you think,
if you
issue-wise or
If
policy-wise?
you look at the immigration package that he offered to the Democrat Senate last year, I think you would have things like that where there was some amnesty and, some border security in exchange for it. You'd have legislation like that. But my experience in Congress was if you're going to get what you want, you really have to give something to the other side in most cases.
Any predictions for tonight? Of course, we could always edit them out. If you...
Well, I'm feeling optimistic, but in this day and age, I'm feeling optimistic, even though history is in favor of the Democrats,
Sure.
money's in favor
Sure.
of the Democrats, intensity is in favor of the Democrats. But one thing that I don't understand anymore is polling, because how do you get to people who don't have landlines when they own cell phones and they don't pick up unknown caller?
Right. Yeah. Trey Hood, Professor Hood here, he runs UGA's polling firm that works with the AJC and WSB, and we got to get him in to give us the talk about in the weeds of how this actually works. I just read the numbers and I guess you read the numbers and hope your weighting and modeling is correct.
I talked to a reporter with the New York Times yesterday, and she said in one congressional district, in order to talk to 500 people, they had to call 30,000.
I did see the New York Times. They're doing. Nate Cohn is doing the live polling, and it's a really good service, because after 2016, people are like, oh, how could this happen? And I do give them credit for trying to sort of clarify the process and explain to people how hard it is to run a statistically significant poll. 30,000 phone calls. That is some serious effort. So what's next for Jack Kingston?
Well, I'm not really sure. I love politics, and the way I describe it is I did a job for 22 years I would have done for free. I enjoyed it so much. But there also is a time to move on and do other things. And so now I'm working for a living, and it's not so bad. And I'm able to do some things with the state party and candidates here and there,
right.
and obviously with the Trump campaign. So I'm enjoying it. Get on CNN and having interviews like this.
Sure. Well, on that note, I'll let you get out of here. I know you've got an election night get-together here in town to get to. But on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia, thank you very much, Congressman Kingston.
Thanks.